whatever. Well, I'm not going to retell my story. The punchline of the story was they told it to put diversity in the images, so then all of the images just had the word diversity on them.
Just like written in the background. There's a poster in the background that this is a diverse image. You know?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, you cannot sue us. This is diversity. What are you going to do? Well, welcome back to the woke political Marxist podcast. Yeah. According to Google AI. What are you going to do? Check in, Dan, before we start with the actual content of this episode. Where's your apocalypse meter at? Where's the doomsday clock?
I don't know. Yeah, I've not been thinking about it. I mean, we were saying beforehand, like there is a part of me that's relieved that Keir Starmer hasn't like carried the UK into this war. So there's part of me that feels, some amount of relief about that. Other than that, it seems, and also there's a sort of, I feel like I'm in a sort of normalization phase. You know, it's like there's a momentary, oh shit, Trump's gone and done it, and then a few weeks in, and it's just like, okay, all the new has become normal. I don't know.
Yeah. I do like that the entire European community has basically just told Trump to fuck off with like helping out with this war. And to a certain point, I think at one point Trump was like, well, I'll try and get China to help. And China was like, no.
Yeah. I mean, the Iranians are already letting Chinese oil tankers leave. Like Iran sells all its oil to China. You know, why would it?
Yeah, I also saw some ex-spook now of he headed up some other intelligence agency, resigned, which in an interesting way, definitely
counterterrorism.
Yeah,
is this the guy in the U.S. government,
the
head of counterterrorism
agency? Yeah, I left the CIA to form the counterterrorism agency. That's a current sentence, but yeah, even he was like, clearly Israel just forced America to do this, and you need to stop.
Yeah, it was remarkable how like. Yeah, because I saw that statement and it was remarkable how scathing, not scathing, just how
candid,
how much it normalized the idea that the US was just following Iran's lead, and
Israel's
also went a lot further than that and was like tried to paint Israel Israel as having a hand in quite a lot, like a much broader analysis of American foreign policy than just Trump's support for the intervention into Iran. So it was quite a stark,
very candid
statement,
very like
candid statement. Yeah.
I'm interested to know what job he was promised after that. It'll be interesting to see where he goes. Like, I don't know.
Yeah. Not
a new job at Goldman Sachs or something like that. What's the old Dulles Brothers firm? Whatever. Zapata Oil is where I'll be working now. Speaking of oil, Dan,
maybe some US gas and oil company that's like, great, stop relying on anyway.
Yeah. Oh God, Jesus.
Speaking of oil, I mean, the title of this essay never really got explained in the. I
know there was just a very small like quote at the beginning that was like, potatoes are now made of oil, and then it was just never brought back again. For the dear listener, what we read this week, we were going to do, as Dan, as you said, another classic social democrat to leftcom flip flop, but we decided we'd push that back at least a week,
at least 3 weeks.
Yeah, exactly. So now what we're doing is we found an essay about agroecology, but kind of exploring it from a different angle than the ones that we found to kind of like stuff to read about before. So this one's kind of coming at it more so from like a systems perspective, which is really, really interesting. And what it is in classic auxiliary statements fashion, someone who wrote an essay summarizing the entire body of thought of people we find interesting and did it in like 20 pages, which we like a lot. And in this context, it was somebody writing about Eugene and Howard Odum. And to kind of try and make a point about kind of get you caught up with their contributions as ecologists to the field of ecology, specifically in the 50s and 60s, and kind of what made them progressive, what made their stuff like kind of radical at a certain point, and then why people don't take their stuff as seriously as they should, or in some cases, why they just, rightfully don't take some of their stuff seriously. But just a quick summary, like the Odums were these really interesting ecologists who diagrammed ecosystems as energy circuits. And they did this for a few reasons that we'll get into, but basically they really wanted to be able to compare qualitatively different ecosystems. And the way that they found to do that was by using what they saw as like the one common input to all of these systems, which at its base is just energy. Energy from the sun, photosynthesis, how it all gets processed, how it leaves kind of the ecosystem, or how it kind of gets recycled, things like that. And in doing that, they came to, what we now know, what everybody with like a brain knows, is like the Starling conclusions about specifically the kind of like green revolution American agriculture, which, most of the world uses now to mass produce food. They came to the conclusion that was just like really, really unstable and potentially catastrophic for the way we produce food from an energy perspective. So yeah, I mean, I really, really enjoyed this. So that was really refreshing to kind of read some agroecology that wasn't like, I don't know, these guys weren't farmers, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe to their benefit and also not to their benefit at some points, but they were very much just like nerds. They were systems theorists, kind of like in similar, I guess, like veins of thought as a lot of cyberneticians, but they were doing something really kind of unique. And yeah, I don't know if it's forgotten about, because as they'll say, loads of people still talk about it, but as the author says, maybe the wrong people are talking about it. So yeah, I like this.
Yeah, I have this suspicion that maybe these two brothers were very much a symptom of the time in which they existed, which, we're all a symptom of the time in which we exist. But like, as you say, there's this intersection with broader systems theory, and there's very much a systems theory influence into their efforts to find new ways to describe ecosystems in general and human ecosystems, and the sort of the parallels and comparisons that can be made between those two. And as you say, the primary focus is on sort of modern, in this case, 20th century agriculture. But in some ways, it feels very much like they're sort of a product of the mid 20th century scientific revolution to some extent. But I also have a suspicion they're sort of perhaps a product of the degree to which I suppose the state was significant to 20th century politics and thinking. I don't know whether you got this impression. I sort of read between the lines and sort of imagined them to be very much. If I have a critique, maybe it's the degree to which they were looking. I would imagine they were envisaging sort of state management of agricultural production along these lines. Like, I feel like they were perhaps of a particular type of managerial elite. That's not to say that I have any, I mean, you and I are both very much lay people in all realms, I suppose, but particularly in this one.
Not just,
so let's not like. I almost said that's not to say that I don't have any critiques. Like, I don't have any critiques largely because I don't have the academic background to have comprehensive critiques of these things. So I'm not trying to level a critique at their ideas. But I did wonder whether there is something in the politics and maybe a degree. Like, I suspect the author talks about them as being somewhat naive, but I don't know whether they're politically naive in the way that we might imagine them to be politically naive, right? If the author is saying they're politically naive, it might be because of the degree of utopianism in what they're thinking or radicalism in what they're proposing, which, we'd be very sympathetic to. But I wonder whether there's a kind of like, well, I mean, our critique would potentially always be that, like, what this theory needs is some good old fashioned anti-capitalism, right? That's often what's lacking in some things. That might, in our reading, that might make them politically naive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it feels like a lot of these people, I mean, even now, obviously, like loads of, potentially progressive agriculturalists and ecologists, it all comes down to, well, the problem is that fossil fuels are cheap and we just need to stop subsidizing them and then everything will all sort itself out. And it's like exactly like what you're saying. Like, the issue isn't, that's not necessarily the issue. And that doesn't make you an anti-capitalist. You realize the first step, kind of, production for, exchange, but like, whatever. I think what you're saying is that if only the Soviet Union had these guys instead of Lysenko, it would have all been fine. There's a way in which Lysenko is very American and these guys are very Soviet, which is kind of funny. But Yeah, I think maybe we get into like their diagrams and stuff in a bit,
Mhm.
and maybe we just kind of talk a little bit about like the. I really find it funny that it's called this, the not very aptly named Green Revolution that led
Mhm.
up to kind of like the, one of the most like world historic advancements in production, which is like the mechanization and just broadly defined, I suppose, like intensification of agriculture, which was predominantly led by the United States after World War II. And this is kind of exactly, all the fixed capital and stuff that was used to create like chemicals and shit and machines for war eventually in some capacity was changed over to make like tractors and to make pesticides and to make fertilizers, which new processes were always being discovered in this kind of few decades, to kind of get agriculture to the point that I would say it probably more or less got stuck at, which is really high productivity, but just like incredibly wasteful, incredibly polluting. And as the Odums would say, is the biggest problem, which is that it runs at a massive energy deficit. And, you know, I'd say this isn't a very aptly named Green Revolution for exactly those reasons, because like this is potentially destroying our ability to create food for any number of reasons. But the Odom's main critique would be that productivity is being confused for energy like sufficiency, I suppose. They're saying because like so many ecologists think that because, and agriculturalists of the time were like, because we're producing more, that must mean that we're being better with our energy inputs. And they're actually saying no, like the huge amount of energy that goes into creating ammonia. I think it's something like between 1% and 2% of the total world's energy production goes into creating ammonia, predominantly for fertilizers and, tractors and all of this shit. Like, because that stuff's so cheap, because we have, what Moore would call one of the however many cheaps, he said like 4 cheaps, 5 cheaps, whatever it was. That's masking what's really going on, which is that we're just like hurtling towards a disaster point with our agriculture, um, because we're actually being incredibly energy wasteful. You know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
and yeah. It's a really apt critique, and it's one that's fairly obvious, I think, now. But the Odom's kind of unique way of looking at it was that way of looking at it through energy production, because we could just be like, yeah, like it's wasteful. Like, look at all the fucking pollution that happens by farmers or whatever. But they're really putting it down to a question of energy, which is their whole thing. They're saying, it's these damn subsidies we're giving all these damn lazy farmers. We just need to, dekulak the United States and do state-owned farming, and it would all be fine.
And put us in charge.
Put us brothers in charge. What characters?
um, yeah, there's a wonderful common sense to this that I think is the core thing that we can take away, is sort of like um, that very succinct way of critiquing um, modern agriculture. There's something also incredibly pioneering about this, right? Like they are really at the forefront of developing a particular critique, and I guess this is at a time where like talk of like fossil fuel and fossil fuel inputs didn't have the significance that it has now, because um, of the increased consciousness around what use of fossil fuels has done to the broader composition of the atmosphere, I suppose, and man-made climate change that's resulted. But yeah, there's a degree to which obviously we've sort of come across this before in different ways, of describing a process that happened in 20th century agriculture, which is almost a process of being subsumed to the logics of capitalism, right? Like what you're describing there is like the striving to find capitalist means for increasing efficiency in the production process, and that's greater use of technology, greater use of machinery. This idea of viewing fertilizer and pesticide inputs as also being measured in a metric of as an energy input, and I suppose seeing them as a byproduct. I don't know whether seems to be the case from my understanding of this. They sort of can be seen as a byproduct of fossil fuel, as a fossil fuel input as well, I suppose. Yeah, they seem to have this really scathing critique. They sort of they the basis of their criticism of the Green Revolution seems to be to say that they're pointing out a degree of naivety in the common sense thinking, which says, well, all we're doing here is um, getting greater efficiency out of a given system. So they talk about it in terms of like um, it being mistaken for an efficiency in the use of solar energy in terms of like the sun, I suppose, but maybe more broadly, like we're making better use of the land that's given to us and the sun that falls onto it to get better outputs of what is a fixed um, sort of status quo system. You know, we're making a system more efficient, um, and one of the interesting things they do in developing these models of analyzing agriculture based on energy inputs is to say that um, um, that well, this is something that comes from their particular type of systems theory, I suppose, in to say that like um, sort of natural systems sort of default or grow over time to being steady state systems. They sort of like most of the energy. This comes from their sort of broader research into sort of like natural ecosystems. They've decided to view these systems as being ones in which most of the energy in a system just goes toward reproducing the system, and the natural course of a system is to develop toward sort of being steady state systems, what they call uh, self-maintained or sort of climax communities they talk about. I don't know. I've lost my train of thought now, but yeah, that's the sort of scientific context that they're sort of like attempting to bring to this
Mm.
study of systems, I guess.
Yeah, it is interesting too. Like you bring that up, like how they started as just studying various ecosystems, studying different ecosystems as brothers, and then seemingly like wanting to come together and find a way to compare them. It's very of its time in almost like a horrifying, like Lovecraftian way, where it's like, and the one of the first ecosystems they both or one of them studied was the atoll that the fucking military blew the shit out of to test all of their nuclear weapons. And it's like the government bought one of them in. I feel like it was Howard. It might have been Eugene though, to study this, coral reef, and then be like, cool. So that's how it works. All right, we're going to completely irradiate and obliterate this place. Thanks for coming in and letting us know. But to get back, to get back to like the green revolution stuff, it's really interesting too to kind of, and this again is, I don't want to be the person that like harps on this too much, but like again, this is where these guys probably could have used a bit of materialism, because it's like, it's really interesting to look at the green revolution as, what you're saying, as this intensification of the production process. But it's very clearly one that has a natural limit, in the way that like a table factory or a computer chip factory, like they don't necessarily have as hard of limits. And that's just because, there are natural rhythms to producing food. Like I don't want to go too woo woo, but there is like, a complex web of life in the soil that we can't really ever have full control of, and that you kind of have to rely on it just being, healthy and doing its own thing. And the sun comes up and it goes down and we have seasons. You're never going to be able to fully subsume agriculture to like the dictates of capitalism. And because of that, like farms, on farm practices, as we kind of read about in the Lewontin and Levin's book, they have a whole chapter on this. Like farms are actually really avoided by big capital, because you can never really monopolize, a strawberry farm, or like chicken farms you can, I guess. But you can't really do that to like most vegetables and fruit, because there's a hard limit to the productivity of something. Like there are certain vegetables, that you can like mechanize the harvesting and growing of in some ways. But most of them, like strawberries and cabbages and watermelons, you just need a lot of people working really hard. And you kind of run up against what's it called? Like the real subsumption of capital into those processes. And you kind of still just have to rely on like, you know, absolute increases in productivity, where it comes from like just forcing the most precarious people in society to work much harder during like horrible conditions and shit like that. That's where your profit margins are. And because of that, like, none of this is in the essay, but it's worth noting, like, because of that, you don't get, the general cartel of strawberry producers. You get like a million different, like, American families relying heavily on government subsidies. And it's the same thing for grain. It's the same thing for like loads of this stuff, because you just run up against these limits. And yeah, it's like this whole, I guess, just to say that like the Green Revolution was part of this real subsumptionist capitalism, but it ends very abruptly, but it still has all of those like soil eroding, polluting, energy wasting, qualities to it.
Mhm.
Yeah, bad.
Yeah, it's, sort of remembered where I was trying to go before in terms of highlighting the sort of systems theory aspects to their thinking. And one of the side effects of that, I think, in their theory is to sort of take the sort of like the solar inputs into this energy system out of the equation when they're sort of analyzing the energy balance of the agricultural system, I suppose. So what they end up doing is arguing that capitalism is just interested in the sort of the gross output of any system, but in this case, like the agricultural system, right? The total amount of kilocalories produced through capitalist agriculture, and line go up. So we're doing a good job in terms of producing food, and therefore we must be being efficient in our production methods because we're producing more food on the same or smaller plots of land and feeding greater populations. Their argument is to say, well, you need to look at the energy inputs to your system and sort of deduct those inputs from the total energy output. That's the necessary thing to do to properly analyze the energy efficiency of these systems. And as you said before, they're actually identifying there being this net energy loss in food production processes. I feel like you could sort of describe it as almost like brute forcing the system. And I guess we have talked about this in the past, like you take a complicated system of any sort, I suppose, and the capitalist methodology, whether it's like managing a factory or sort of like managing any particular type of system, the modern capitalist methodology is to simplify it and sort of use brute force, sort of mechanize the processes, eliminate all of the sort of like extraneous variables, I suppose, and create something which is predictable and reproducible and manageable. Because I guess they've created a manageable system, but they've managed all the eccentricities of a natural system through heavy use of pesticides, massive nutrient inputs in the form of artificial fertilizers, and what this results in is considerably greater inputs than are actually represented in the gross outputs of the system, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. It's exactly what you're saying. It's line go up. And it's, it's one of the reasons that, like, in a similar way, it's kind of hard to talk to liberals now about like why the profit rate has supposedly been falling forever, because it's like Apple's profits are fucking bigger than they've ever been. Everybody's making so much money. And it's like, well, yeah, but we're talking about like relative return on investment. Like, okay, Apple made an absurd amount of money last year. Why does it have several $billion just sitting in offshore accounts doing nothing? You know what I mean?
I'm glad you made that
Yeah.
allusion, because I was trying to work out whether that was a justified thing to say. There is a similarity to the tendential fall in the rate of profit, isn't there? Where like seemingly the outputs are growing, but in the background there's this sort of like degradation of the process happening, sort of out of sight.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I mean, it does bring up that central, like in this context too, that central kind of question that a lot of ecologists now have grappled with. We read about it in the Jason W. Moore, where it's like, to what extent does capitalism actually require things that are cheap and that it can appropriate? Because it's like, the green revolution doesn't happen if we're on a planet with no fossil fuels. I mean, like, what does happen with capitalism at a certain point if there are no fossil fuels? You know what I mean? Like, and, you know, the green revolution was also like the thing that led up to that, and the thing that supposedly like saved Europe from like massive famines because it had just used up and exhausted all of its land, was before the green revolution. It was just like fucking millions of acres of the most fertile land in America. And then the Dust Bowl happened, and everybody's like, okay, now their famines might be back. And then capital steps in, and, you know,
And
obviously.
massive amounts of bird poo as well.
Yeah, exactly. What are you going to do? Yeah, okay. So I guess we can talk a little bit about their kind of like systems theory dictates and stuff too. And a lot of this stuff does jive a lot with the cybernetics. There's an allusion to cybernetics in here about how that was kind of going on in the background um, of the kind of like academic world as they were writing all of this stuff. I don't know to what extent they explicitly thought of themselves as like systems theorists or cyberneticians. Almost certainly systems theorists, I guess, although it seemed like they were much more interested in the math behind these circuits and these diagrams than anything else. But one thing that really does drive with a lot of that stuff is this idea of a kind of like universal recursivity in all of their diagrams, where they're like, one of the main mistakes that ecologists make is they go, I am studying this orchid, so I will study only the ecosystem in this swamp in Florida. And they're like, well, yeah, you can do that, but there's one side of it where that swamp is in a state, and that state does this, and it's, you know, prone to these weather conditions that come up from the Gulf, blah 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 blah. But then their other main point, one of their main dictats that ties into that, is that like all human systems are also part of that recursivity. So when you're talking about biosphere, when you're talking about one little, you know, niche, ecological niche, you need to also be talking about the human relations that go on into there. And, you know, this is always, it's always nice when we read something not written by Marxists and they come to like very socialist conclusions, because it's like, yeah, this is something that's missing from like all bourgeois ecology, which is just like the need to study human systems as well. And, you know, the Odums weren't going to take that to its logical conclusion that we would say, which is like, well, you need to be studying the relationships of production. That's like the main set of relations we need to be studying. But they are recognizing that in a very Bookchinian way, I would say, they're recognizing that like no environment sits on its own outside of us. And especially if we're studying something like, you know, the atoll in the middle of the Pacific, it's like, well, what's going to happen to this place? And, you know, what human activities can we expect to completely incinerate this place? But yeah, it's those two ideas, this recursivity of ecological spheres and niches. And they say something very similar to Guy with the Beard, the beer, where they say something like something along the lines of the only highest level of recursion is just all energy and matter in the universe. It's like, yeah, it's very true. And then they just take it a step further and also say that that also includes us and our relationships with this ecology. Especially these guys were born in like the 1910s and 1920s. It's very, I would say, it's seemingly very advanced for like capitalist society back then, I would say.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's definitely something very much in line with the kind of idea of homeostatic systems, and homeostasis being a central tenet of cybernetics. And they seem to have definitely imported a lot of that into their study of systems, in terms of them largely being closed systems, right? Self-correcting, but also there's a degree to which I think what they found very appealing about this is in quite a lot of their systems, lots of things that are outputs sort of become inputs again, and there's quite a lot of like a lot of these systems are turned back on themselves, I think, to a degree. The thing that I found really interesting, I mean, they have these like 3 laws for sort of like analyzing use of energy in systems, but particularly in like ecological systems. And the first 2 are just kind of like conservation of energy, and sort of like and also one in terms of like entropy and the sort of dissipation of energy in a system. And then the third one is this kind of like Darwinian principle about the sort of evolution of systems, particularly basically based on the idea that systems evolve toward the most maximally efficient use of energy, which seems fair enough. But I thought interesting that they take it, because you could think about like a biological system, you could think about a human being or a cell or something, and say, well, yeah, they're gonna like you try and use energy in the most efficient way, try not to radiate too much away, and sort of like um, make the most effective use of it. But then they take this step further and sort of like apply or imply a kind of like evolutionary logic to bigger and bigger systems, ecological systems, human systems, and sort of imply that there's this sort of like Darwinian process at work as well, which I think is something that they seemingly came in for some criticism for. I think perhaps of just like almost implying that systems are these sort of like thinking processes that have aims. And they're definitely criticized for anthropomorphizing some of these systems because they think that they have these sort of like aims in mind. But I don't have any issue with think sort of imagining systems to have to generate sort of outcomes predicated on the sort of like lower level choices that are being made. It's emergence, right? That's the word I'm looking for. There being some kind of emergent structure from lower levels of recursion in a system, sort of like rising through to higher levels, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you're right to say that one of the main critiques was that they were kind of like applying these human characteristics to some systems, and you're always going to be able to point to one system where it's like, well, look at this coral reef, it wastes energy like crazy. And it's like, okay, I think broadly, as if nothing else, that third Darwinian law, it's like it's useful to understand how we might try and design systems. You're not trying to have maximum output. What you're trying to do is like, yeah, produce for what you need and not waste shit. It's like put like that. It's like, oh yeah, you know. Um, yeah, there were a few other things that were brought up in here about in terms of critiques of their ideas. One of them, and I think which is clearly I think just the most obvious, but again, you said this at the beginning. This is just them being a product of their time. They came to all of these supposedly, and in academies, like at the time, probably were quite like radical ideas about the way that farms need to be managed, all of this different stuff, and they portrayed it as something new. But it's very clear that even though they thought it was new, a lot of these farming practices that they were talking about had just been going on forever outside of like WASP America, right? Specifically like pre-capitalist agricultural practices. And, the author of this essay kind of dings them a little bit for like their histories of agriculture and ecology, I suppose, specifically, really only like citing ecologists from the last century, specifically like, Anglo-Saxon maybe or European ecologists, when it's like, and the interesting thing about that is like the author of this essay isn't trying to be like they should have been more woke or whatever. Like the point is there's a huge amount of knowledge and like a wealth of information that you could glean from studying these societies and their agricultural practices and their relationships with their ecologies. But I don't want to go so far as to say like their racism stopped them from doing that, but probably just like the institutional, like it probably would have been pretty weird if they showed up to like Missouri State or whatever they taught and they were like, today we're going to be studying like the practices of the Native Americans because they're like infinitely more advanced in their ways of thinking about ecological philosophy than us. That probably wouldn't have gone over very well. But the point of that is just, ton of information out there that they were kind of probably structurally blocked from gleaning.
I mean, there are some aspects of which they did seem to be. I got the impression they were quite interested in sort of other forms of agricultural production. There's sort of this interest in sort of African cattle herding and how those systems function as being more energy efficient and more energy sort of sound on the basis of a study of their energy use. I sort of came away with the idea that they were somewhat more like quote unquote progressive for their time, in the sense that like at least they didn't fall into the trap of saying there is this emerging, developing world, and they're sort of like over reproducing and not developing food systems that are going to allow them to have a sustainable population or population growth or population or agricultural system. And to their credit, the Odums are like so much more fixated on criticizing Western American agriculture. It's the inefficiency of its systems, but also the having these systems that then allow for massive exports that are almost like supporting population growth in other parts of the world. Like it's the fault of the American agricultural system. It's not some kind of like failing or sort of some kind of failing of developing countries.
Yeah, who's the guy that wrote that book that was like, and they're just breeding themselves into poverty, and it was like one of the most popular books of the year. It's like, okay, that's where society was at. No, yeah, I think more so the author was just saying that in their history, it's not so much in their agricultural interests, it's more so in their histories of ecology that they tried to write about. That it was a bit more like, and we've figured it all out. And it's like,
oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Because there was that quote in there that I really liked, where it was, I think it was from Gandhi. Hopefully, it was from Gandhi.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Where it was something like, in India, cattle are sacred because they're necessary. It's like that says it all. Wow, cool.
That's some really materialism for you.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh well, there you go. Yeah, and so I'd say one of the other critiques though that comes up is that. And this is one that we would recognize from like second order cybernetics stuff, which is that they very much believed, and you got into this a little bit at the beginning, that the role of the ecologist in society, they didn't quite use this word, but it's something of a technocrat. It's something of somebody who sits at the top of the system. And this part's good because they're able to get a macro view through their studies in their telling of it, of the energy inputs and outputs of the system. They're able to see it all in a way that they would say that, the simple farmer is not able to do just by virtue of their position within the system. And they're able to kind of make these tweaks in their perfect, state controlled, agricultural commissar role. They're able to make these tweaks and control everything. And the criticism of that is that farmers just become parts of a system that are supposed to just do what they're told. And to a certain extent, every other part of the system is just supposed to kind of do what it's told because the ecologist is able to see everything. And we would probably come to that from a critique of like variety, which is like, okay, to a certain extent, in the perfectly planned society, you would want people whose job it is to like sit at this macro level and at least advise and suggest things about, the way the system is going or whatever, because they're able to devote so much of their time to studying the system from this macro lens. But at the same time, we would probably say like the only people who are going to be capable of responding to any number of like system perturbations or even just make suggestions for how the system could work better, and the people who are placed best to do that are the people actually doing the work, right? So the interesting kind of cybernetics question here is, how do you balance those two things? Because I'm very much not saying like, well, the ecologist role that the Odums are saying shouldn't exist. It's very much like, how do you balance that system, that higher level organizational systems component, with the people actually doing the work who are best set to kind of like dynamically respond to these things? And yeah, I mean, I have no idea, but it's just a really interesting question of like, yeah, I don't know, in the perfect world, like, I mean, I suppose now I'm going to go a bit too far. That's a question for low communism. I would say high communism, it would just be that everybody has always had the opportunities to take whichever role they want and to fully study like this productive apparatus now that it's been completely demystified. And everybody, hopefully, who's involved in agriculture would just have that level of understanding. You know what I mean? Now that everything's been demystified, but that's more than a few years off. So what are you going to do?
Well, I mean, I suppose it's just recognizing. Well, to a certain extent, I feel like that in this theory there is a sort of non-technocratic version agricultural management that's being proposed, right? Like I was implying before, that sort of for a system to think in the way that they're implying potentially it might be able to do, there has to be some amount, some sort of emergent features. and also there's a degree to which the modeling that they're doing, any modeling is always a simplification of a much more complicated system. They also seem to have a recognition that, that the more energy conserving, the more energy efficient agricultural system, the more energy efficient system in general, is more complicated, more regionally specific, in a way that a technocrat is never really going to be able to comprehend necessarily. Sort of like abstract modeling is never going to be able to solve in its entirety. I feel like cybernetics offers us a model for this, in the sense that, like, the sort of lower orders of regression in a viable system should operate on their own recognizance up until the point when they need help, and then you sort of have this capacity to signal for help from a sort of like higher level, more global view of the operations of a system, kind of thing. So it might be possible to have positive, divergent but complementary roles for technocratic overseers and informed, able, self-directing agricultural producers, I suppose.
Yeah, and vice versa too, right? Where it's like, I mean, this is just exactly what you're saying, but it's like, hey, farmers, a hurricane's coming. Hey, farmers, Trump has attacked Iran. Don't expect any fertilizers in this next shipment, like stuff like that, right? Like, only getting involved when you need to, kind of thing. Yeah. One part of this that I really loved is how they kind of came to this idea that, and this is kind of what this essay specifically is all about. The thing that they're trying to rescue for the Odums is their idea that rescuing agriculture from capitalism, they wouldn't use the term capitalism, they'd probably just say the Green Revolution, requires an overhaul of human social systems. And again, they don't necessarily mean human productive relations, but they kind of came to this because, okay, let's model the energy inputs and outputs of this marshland or of this atoll. And then they're like, oh, we can do this for farming too. Let's do this for farming. Okay. Oh, wow, this is really out of balance. Where's this energy imbalance coming from? Oh, okay, well, let's model where the fossil fuels are coming from. Oh, okay, well, now if we're going to model where the fossil fuels are coming from. And they just slowly realized that if you're modeling a farm, what you're actually doing is modeling all of human society. And it's the same thing for like any other, ecological or economic structure. Like, nothing sits in isolation completely in a vacuum. But the thing that's so interesting about them is that they realized that rescuing agriculture, like I'm saying, would require rescuing and completely reworking human civilization, or at least human social systems. And there are three different veins of agroecologists that they kind of in their careers critiqued a lot. And the one that I'll just touch on now is kind of like what they called agrarian romantics. So people who wanted to kind of like return to the soil, and like, we'll eventually get on to talking about like the organics people and movements like that kind of like, took a lot of their thinking and kind of misrepresented it in certain ways. But these were people who recognized that in their view, there was an imbalance between humanity on one side and nature on the other side. And they really, really critiqued this because they were saying it's not about a balance at all. And this is where they're hugely progressive. They're like, it's not about a balance. It's actually about making human society more closely represent ecological systems. That's the only way any of this stuff is going to work. It's like, wow, that's cool. They were writing about this stuff in like the 50s and the 60s. That's so crazy that they were like, I mean, I don't know. I guess I should give people credit. Like Rachel Carson, wrote Silent Spring or whatever, I think in the 60s and stuff like that. But still, it's like, that's a very radical idea now, even among like socialist circles. I know a lot of people probably, might not want to admit that, but like, even, obviously like the history of socialism is not necessarily the history of ecologically sufficient systems. So yeah, it's a great critique.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and dare I say, sort of like to some degree dialectical as well. There's a rather than there being this polar this uh, dyadic distinction between human beings and nature, and we just have to find some way of existing in balance. It's sort of rather to recognize that there are analogous ways that both human and natural systems operate, and human systems have to learn to operate more like natural systems. And it's only through sort of that recognition of the commonality can the two things sort of like coexist, but sort of exist as one at the same time, kind of thing. So I don't know whether that's dialectical necessarily, but it's a interesting positive sort of development in the theory, I guess.
Yeah, it's a type of negation, Dan. Is really
it's a type of negation.
So yeah, just to quickly touch on those other two veins of agroecology, and I think maybe just like upfront, what I'll say about like why agroecology is so interesting is because especially in lefty circles, people are really reticent of like trying to solve the agricultural question because it's like it's very complicated and it seems like it should just be left up to people who know what they're doing. And it's like, we're socialists, we only care about production. And it's like, yeah, the most important part of production. It's like, hey, wait a minute. But, a lot of people will kind of point to stuff like permaculture or whatever, or like concrete systems as being like, we just need to do that. We need to be producing like that kind of on the left. But the point of agroecology isn't necessarily to give you like specific concrete solutions to your problems of growing strawberries or whatever. It's supposed to be like a heuristic for understanding and like giving you guidelines and a methodology, I guess, really of like exactly like what you're saying, like how we can get these systems to more closely model ecological systems. That's kind of like the one rule of agroecology. Then everybody goes off from there. So the reason that I'm kind of bringing that up is because, as I said, like there were multiple veins of agroecology that the Odums disagreed with and like polemicized against. And another one of them, other than like the agrarian romantics, but kind of similar, I feel like a lot of these people are very similar, they just broadly defined as like alternative agriculturalists. So like maybe you're more permaculture-y people now, you're more food foresty type people, like, and again, this is very similar to like a Bookchin critique of a lot of this stuff. The Odums would just say that those people were just broadly too mistrusting of technology. It's like, they see industrial farming, they see industrial society, and they think all industrial society is bad. They think technology on a farm, they see it and they think all technology is bad. And obviously, like that's not really the point. Like it's the human social systems that are putting the technology to use, right? It's not like everybody would just have a scythe and like a fucking, like it's like you wouldn't have tractors or something like that in the society, and you would still have to have some fertilizer production, like, unfortunately. And then just the other one, which I'll just really quickly touch on, is they were very popular, well, not popular, I mean they were probably the most successful in terms of getting their ideas out there just because they were a government agency. I think this was the Soil Conservation Service, and they thought of themselves also as agroecologists in their time. And all they were doing was just basically like, how can we more ecologically produce much more at a much higher rate? They were just like, they saw all of the problems, but they didn't understand that the issue wasn't just that we're using, too many pesticides, too many fertilizers, and too much DDT or whatever. Like the issue, I mean, the issue is exchange value versus use value. The issue is that they weren't producing for use, and that's kind of more or less what the Odums would say. So it's interesting. It was interesting just seeing these different, branches of agroecology.
Yeah, I feel like the Odums would say that there are elements in all of them that are an important part of the picture, but they don't grasp the whole situation, but primarily because they're not seeing it in terms of these sort of like processes which utilize energy. I think like in some ways there's kind of like an ironic end to this story, which is like, to a certain degree, the Odums were trying to be more scientific, particularly than the sort of like organic farmers who just sort of seem to have this sort of like instinctual opposition to the use of technology in farming, and a very sort of like health focused orientation where they were just like had this revulsion toward the idea of pesticides and artificial fertilizers, but not predicated on any sort of scientific basis of there being some health threat, but just this sort of like gut reaction kind of thing. But so they were trying to be more scientific and present theories which could be more useful to broader society and be more generally appealing and might actually be implemented, might be able to appeal to government and what have you. And in actual fact, it seems like the opposite happened, where the only people that actually took up these ideas were these three categories of person that you're describing. And in some ways, what they did was sort of gave some scientific ammunition to, to the sort of organic farmers and the people worried about soil, and the sort of like agricultural traditionalists, I suppose, but didn't really like break out of that. I don't know, hippie silo, I guess.
You said it. You said it. I'm glad you said it.
Yeah.
It's funny, in each of their own ways, I feel like they all represent those three types of agroecologists all represent something wrong with capitalism. It's like, okay, that's commodity fetishism, that's technological determinism, like that's just pure ideological romanticism. Yeah, and I mean, one maybe we just go off that and just have this brief talk now, which is just that when you hear a lot about the Odums now, you generally hear about it from, unfortunately, these exact types of people. A lot of the hippies, a lot of the kind of like organics movement, which gets a lot of shit in this essay, which, hey, organic food. You should have organic food if you can.
But we might be co-travelers of these people.
Yeah, exactly. But the point is that, this fundamental understanding, which is verging on being a Marxist one, which is that the Odums had, which is that, human social systems need to more broadly represent ecological systems, and that it isn't so much the point of a rift, a metabolic rift, right? As just like, for them, it's energy and it's social construction. But yeah, it's like, generally when you hear about the Odums now, it's through a lot of these people who want to talk about a type of metabolic rift and the organics movement and stuff like that. And the author of this essay is really trying to make the point that, like, I suppose the thesis of his essay, other than just giving you a brief rundown of the Odums, is that main core part of their research project, mirroring social systems and agricultural systems, like that's kind of been lost to time because all people want to talk about is waste. Which, like, yeah, there's waste, but like farmers would tell you there's waste. Like farmers know that. They just don't give a fuck, like
because all they're trying to do is, produce for profit.
Exactly.
Quite self-consciously, just
should we talk about the farmer block? That's how this essay ends, which is very funny. Another unfortunate thing about the Odums is that they really tried to change policy in the United States, and they really tried to get involved with politics to a certain extent, to bring these ideas to, like, agricultural boards and things like that. And they failed, obviously, because of the productive relations of society. But to be a bit more concrete than that, it's pretty clear that when they tried to bring these ideas to farmers and to agricultural kind of like technocrats, and politicians specifically, I should say, the biggest block that they found was from farmers themselves, which it doesn't seem like they really expected, because they're kind of telling them like, hey, here's how you could just like permanently have your farms be relatively energy sustainable. And the fact that the farmers were like, nah, absolutely not, we're not interested in that, shocked them. And the reason for it is just because farmers get a lot of subsidies, and it's a reciprocal relationship between them and like rural politicians whose constituencies are predominantly farmers, because they get them the subsidies that they need to keep farming in an incredibly polluting and wasteful and increasingly not very productive way. And in return, they get funding from these farmers and their votes. And, ideologically, those people tend to be quite reactionary and conservative. These aren't necessarily like your Bernie Sanders types. These are more of your like, I don't know, just go to any rural constituency, go to the website where you can see like these people's voting records and their funding, and it'll just be like, they're quite horrible politicians, right? But the Odums weren't sociologists, right? They were ecologists, and they did their best. So I find it kind of hard to blame them for that one.
I feel like one of the quite satisfying, I suppose, conclusions of this essay seems to be a recognition, something that we've come across before, which is that like it might just be the case that we just need more human labor to go into agricultural production. Obviously, that's one of the things that's been taken out of the sort of agricultural production process as it has become more subsumed to capitalist production as a sort of like exchange of human labor for machine inputs and other pesticide and fertilizer inputs. But it's definitely acknowledged at the end of this essay that might have to be one of the conclusions. Some of these people doing other jobs in the economy might just have to go back to working in agriculture. I wonder whether the very simple analysis of that would be that like that actually represents a return of energy back into the agricultural system. It kind of like closes one of these energy loops, so there isn't like an escape of energy from the system and a necessity to bring in extraneous energy in the terms of fertilizers or machinery or fossil fuel powered whatever.
Or layabout sitting on the dole, put them back
but
to
I
work.
am starting to sound a bit I don't know,
I think
a bit
it's
like
a really
hippie,
good point.
I guess. But
I think it's a really good point. I mean, sooner or later, socialists are probably going to have to come to terms with, at least in this industry, more people will have to work, or at least, labor productivity is going to go down. What are you going to do?
It just seemed like an interesting. Just speaking about thinking off the top of my head now, it sort of like seems like an interesting way of also thinking in terms of labor power and labor as the input to production. That's sort of the essential element. If you could just analyze labor in terms of energy, just human energy expended.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. Because I mean, if you think about like one of the ways in which energy is just wasted, if you think about herbicides, right? That's a shit ton of energy that's going into doing something that it increasingly is not being able to do, at least in terms of like grain production, which is kill weeds. You're going to have to get the energy to get rid of those super weeds somewhere. And you're right. Yeah, labor power is going to be the way you do that. Unless we create drones that can zap weeds from, outer space or something. But that's a really good point.
Or yeah, it's sort of that in conjunction with I don't know, like increased diversity of the ecosystems and improving the soil ecology and diversifying the crops that are grown in a particular area, and all that ecological good sense, I guess.
Yeah. And there was a bit of this where it kind of seemed like they verged into a little bit when they were talking about the pioneer species versus the climax species, where it was like farmers now aren't letting plants become climax species because all they give a shit about is just producing for max profitability. And then there's weak plants that like one fungus comes along and they just like pop over and you don't have potatoes for a year or something.
Yeah. I mean, it's a remarkable way of analyzing what's been done to livestock production in contemporary farming as well. Like, feedlots, meaning that cattle don't even have to graze, or like creating chickens that are no longer able to do internal homeostatic regulation of their body temperature because they're just being raised in battery farmed sort of factory conditions where that homeostatic function is outsourced to a heating thermostat to solve that problem, I guess. So, it was sort
frequently
of like,
which runs on fossil fuels.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah. I did find this kind of like pioneer versus climax stage thing a bit confusing or even objectionable, in the sense that there's an extent to which it creates a kind of like teleological structure. I can see why it would seem appealing, particularly if you're looking at the evolution of human society, and you want to say that maybe human beings are stuck in this particular mode, the kind of like pioneer mode where they're exploiting their ecosystem, growing in ways which are not in equilibrium with creating a positive energy balance in their system. You might want to hypothesize a sort of teleological process where all species kind of like transition from being in this sort of like pioneer exploiter mode into the kind of like climax stage where they exist in energy balance internally and externally with the systems that they create and the systems that comprise the environments that they exist in, kind of thing. I think it's just the kind of like the sort of progressive staged element to it felt, potentially naive or a little bit like tacked on. My inclination would be to sort of like want to think more in terms of equilibrium and disequilibrium, like disequilibrium is brought about and then equilibrium can reassert itself, which might be just a different way of saying the same thing. I don't know, but it sort of sits better with me. I don't know how you felt about that.
I think so. Yeah. I think so. I mean, I think trying to apply those ideas, in one sense, it's too abstract to really mean anything. And on the other sense, it's almost not abstract enough, because like applying that idea about climax species and stuff like that to maybe like systems as a whole is something I'm a bit more open to. But to plants concretely, like, I'm sorry, not even just plants. We're talking about crops. Like, no, there's always going to be a huge extent to which, like, unless we're just foraging for everything because we've designed like continent-wide food forests, which is never going to happen. Like, there's always going to be an extent to which these plants are like not climax species because we've designed them to do something that they're not really like designed naturally to do. And, obviously like heirloom varieties of plants are going to be a lot better at that than, whatever shit you can just go buy that has like sterile seeds. But yeah, I found it to be not necessarily like hugely useful. Because again, you would be designing these plants to live in conjunction, not with their natural environment necessarily, but with like human societies, because they're crops. Like, this is probably more useful when we're talking about, off-farm ecologies, you know what I'm saying? Like when we're talking about Yosemite versus when we're talking about like food for people to eat, I think, Cool stuff.
Yeah.
Speaking of agricultural labor, I don't even want to go here. Did you hear about Cesar Chavez?
No.
Okay, then we're not going to go there.
No,
Look it up. Unfortunately, this is the year of all of your faves, from Noam Chomsky to Cesar Chavez, turning out to be huge pieces of shit. And in Cesar Chavez's case, much more of a piece of shit than Noam Chomsky. So what are you going to do? I only just found out about this yesterday. There was an article in the LA Times that was like, nobody knows what it is, but apparently some stuff's about to come out about Cesar Chavez, because like every agricultural laborers union in America has canceled all of their events honoring him, and we don't know what it is, but apparently it's really bad. And then it came out today and it's really bad. So what are you going to do? Anyway.
Well, the sort of great man theory sort of takes another hit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What are you going to do? This has absolved me of ever reading my like 600-page verso book on Cesar Chavez, though. So,
sending that one to the charity shop.
Sending that one, yeah. What are you gonna do? All right, I really enjoyed that, Dan. We'll be back hopefully next time with another political flip flop between social democracy and communization, but. We'll pepper the agroecology in there every now and then.
It was fun to return to this kind of thing. It's clearly like. Outside of but adjacent to our wheelhouse kind of thing. So I enjoy it.
And do you know what happened last night? Venezuela won the World Baseball Classic. They beat America. Hey. So we're riding high, baby. We're riding high. A bunch of fans were chanting Maduro as they were leaving, which is very funny. So, cool.
Well, good for them.
Good for them. All right, Dan.
Bye-bye.
Till next time.
Thanks, John.
Bye-bye. Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us if we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there. Or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.